In space, sound doesn't travel through the air. There is no air. The vacuum is absolute, an endless freezing silence that swallows everything. So when you hear a noise aboard an orbital station, it's because the sound waves are traveling through the physical structure itself. The titanium hull, the aluminum framing, the steel bulkheads, they act like tuning forks, carrying vibrations directly into the pressurized modules, straight into the soles of your boots and the bones of your skull. You get used to the normal sounds, the low, throbbing hum of the atmospheric scrubbers, the arrhythmic clicking of the coolant pumps cycling ammonia through the external radiators, the occasional sharp crack of the outer shielding expanding and contracting as the station crosses from the freezing shadow of the Earth into the boiling glare of the sun. Those sounds mean you are alive. They mean the multi-billion-dollar tin can you live in is doing its job. But there is one sound you never, ever want to hear when you are entirely alone, floating 400 miles above the surface of the Earth. I was strapped into the command chair in the main observation module, compiling the daily telemetry reports when it happened. My fingers froze over the keyboard. I held my breath, the only sound the rushing of blood in my own ears. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. I let out a slow, ragged exhale, chalking it up to a micrometeoroid impact. The Artemis Hub had taken plenty of hits over its 10-year lifespan. Tiny flecks of paint or grains of sand traveling at 17,000 miles per hour could sound like a hammer strike when they hit the Kevlar-weave debris shields. It was normal. It was fine. I turned my attention back to the glowing monitors. But then it happened again. It was louder this time. Sharper. It wasn't the chaotic, instantaneous crack of a high-velocity impact. It was deliberate. It had a distinct rhythm. The gaps between the strikes were perfectly even, spaced exactly a second apart. It was a knock, and it was coming from the outside of the primary airlock hatch. My stomach plummeted, a cold knot of pure primal dread tightening in my gut. I stared at the heavy, reinforced steel door at the far end of the module. Beyond that door was the staging room. Beyond that was the exterior hatch. And beyond that was the endless, freezing void. There was absolutely no reason for anything to be knocking on that hatch, because there was no one else on the station, and there hadn't been for 12 days. My name is Riley Vance, and I am, or was, a senior decommissioning specialist for Vanguard Orbital. When a private corporation decides their orbital real estate is no longer profitable, they don't just leave it up there to become a navigation hazard. They send a crew to strip it of anything valuable, wipe the proprietary data from the servers, and prep the station for a controlled deorbit into the Pacific Ocean. That was the Artemis Hub, once a state-of-the-art orbital data center and zero-gravity research lab. It had been deemed obsolete. The main crew of 14 engineers, scientists, and technicians had packed up and left on the final corporate shuttle nearly 2 weeks ago. I had volunteered to stay behind. The job required one person to remain on board for an additional 14 days to physically wipe the offline deep storage server cores, a tedious manual process that couldn't be done remotely due to the station's heavy encryption protocols. It was supposed to be easy money. 2 weeks of absolute solitude, eating vacuum-sealed rations, floating through empty corridors, and running deletion algorithms. Vanguard was paying me triple my usual rate for the inconvenience. The first week had been peaceful, almost meditative. The station was massive, a sprawling complex of interconnected cylindrical modules, solar arrays, and server spines. Living in zero gravity does strange things to the human mind. Without a natural day-night cycle, your circadian rhythm unravels. You start to lose track of time. The silence becomes a physical weight pressing against your eardrums. You start talking to yourself just to hear a voice. You start seeing movement in your peripheral vision, just shadows cast by the rotating solar sails outside the windows. But you remind yourself that it's just isolation psychology. Third man factor, they call it. The brain's desperate attempt to create companionship in an environment completely devoid of life. I had read all the psychological briefings before I accepted the contract. I knew what to expect. What I didn't expect was a deliberate, rhythmic knock on a hatch that opened to the vacuum of space. I unbuckled the harness strapping me to the command chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. In zero gravity, panic is dangerous. If you push off a wall too hard, you'll send yourself flying uncontrollably into a bulkhead. I forced myself to breathe slowly, my mind desperately searching for a logical explanation. Thermal expansion, I told myself. It's just the metal groaning. It's a failing valve in the external ammonia lines. It's not a knock. I pushed off the console, drifting smoothly through the cylindrical module toward the security station. I grabbed the handrails, anchoring my boots under a strap, and brought up the external camera feeds. The Artemis Hub was covered in high-definition optics designed to monitor the exterior for structural damage. I cycled through the feeds. Camera 1, the starboard solar arrays, completely intact, glowing golden in the sunlight. Camera 3, the communications dish, tracking properly. Camera 7, the exterior of the primary airlock. I pulled up the feed and stared at the screen. The heavy white metal of the hatch was perfectly pristine. There was no shuttle docked. There was no debris snagged on the handholds. There was nothing, just the vast, terrifying emptiness of space, a bottomless black ocean dotted with the cold, uncaring light of distant stars. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. "You're losing it, Riley," I whispered into the empty room, my voice sounding weak and thin. "It's just the station settling. It's just the plumbing." I spent the next 3 hours running diagnostic checks on every external system, looking for anomalies. I found a slight fluctuation in pressure in one of the secondary coolant loops, nothing that would explain the sound, but enough to satisfy my desperate need for a mechanical explanation. By the time I finished, the artificial lighting in the station dimmed, the automated system simulating a night cycle to keep my biological clock relatively sane. I retreated to my quarters in the habitation ring, a space no bigger than a walk-in closet, zipped myself into my sleeping bag tethered to the wall, and closed my eyes. I told myself I was fine. I told myself I only had 2 days left before the extraction shuttle arrived to bring me home. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I drifted off, I heard it echoing in my mind. My eyes snapped open in the darkness. My blood turned to ice water. That wasn't a mechanical failure. That wasn't a random sequence of thermal groans. It was shave and a haircut. Someone or something was deliberately mocking me. I tore myself out of the sleeping bag, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the zippers. I didn't bother turning on the main lights. The emergency strips along the floor cast a dim, bloody red glow over the curved walls of the habitation ring. I floated out into the main corridor, my ears straining against the heavy hum of the life support. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed felt incredibly heavy, charged with a malicious energy. I realized then that the sound hadn't come from the primary airlock this time. It had come from much closer. It sounded like it had come from the ceiling of the corridor, right above my head. But there was no ceiling. The station was built in concentric layers. There was the inner pressure hall, the walls of the corridor I was in. Then there was a 3-foot interstitial gap, a crawl space filled with thick bundles of wiring, plumbing, and environmental ducting. And beyond that gap was the outer Kevlar and titanium micrometeoroid shield. The gap between the halls was unpressurized. It was open to the vacuum of space to prevent explosive decompression in the event of a hull breach. Nothing could survive in there without a fully operational extravehicular activity (EVA) suit. I reached up, placing my bare palm flat against the cold, curved metal of the corridor wall. I closed my eyes, trying to feel any vibration. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then I felt it, a vibration, very faint, very slow. It wasn't a knock, it was a scrape. It felt exactly like fingernails dragging across the other side of the titanium plate. I jerked my hand back as if the metal had burned me. I shoved off the wall, floating backward down the corridor, my breathing becoming rapid and shallow. I was completely unarmed. There are no weapons on a commercial space station. The most dangerous thing on board was a heavy magnetic hydrospanner in the maintenance bay. I needed to see what was in that gap. I raced back to the command module, my movements frantic, bouncing off the padded walls. I threw myself into the chair and brought up the internal schematics of the station. The interstitial gaps weren't monitored by cameras. There was no reason for them to be. But they were rigged with a network of thermal sensors designed to detect electrical fires or coolant leaks. I bypassed the standard monitoring software, typing frantically, digging into the raw data feeds from the thermal network in the habitation ring. I pulled up a wireframe 3D model of the station on the primary monitor and overlaid the thermal data. The screen bloomed with colors. The interior of the station was a comfortable, warm orange. The exterior hull, facing the sun, was bright white, while the shadowed side was deep blue. The interstitial gap between them showed up as a neutral, freezing black, except for one spot. Directly above the corridor where I had just been floating, there was a heat bloom, a small, concentrated mass of dark red and yellow. It was roughly the size of an adult human, and as I watched the live feed, the heat bloom began to move. It wasn't drifting aimlessly like a loose piece of heated debris. It was moving with agonizing, deliberate slowness. It crawled along the curve of the hull, navigating the dense jungle of wiring and pipes in the vacuum. It moved a few feet, then stopped, then moved again. I stared at the screen in absolute horror. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't alone on the Artemis Hub. Someone was in the walls. But how? It was impossible. A person in an EVA suit is bulky, clumsy. They couldn't fit into the tight crawl spaces of the interstitial gap without getting hopelessly wedged between the plumbing. And if they weren't in a suit, they would be dead in seconds. The vacuum would boil the saliva on their tongue and rupture their lungs. Yet there it was, a living, moving heat signature, crawling through the unpressurized dark. I needed a weapon. I needed a way to defend myself. I pushed off the console and headed for the maintenance bay in Module 4. My mind raced, trying to piece together a rational explanation, but logic was failing me. Could someone have stayed behind during the evacuation? Could there be a stowaway? If so, how were they surviving in an unpressurized zone? I entered the maintenance bay, the lights flickering on automatically. The room was organized chaos, tools secured to magnetic walls, diagnostic equipment strapped to workbenches. I floated over to the heavy tool rack and grabbed a solid steel hydro spanner. It was 2 feet long, heavy and brutal. It wasn't a gun, but it felt good in my hand. As I turned to leave the bay, something caught my eye. On a small folding table near the corner of the room, strapped down with bungee cords, were my daily ration packs. I had organized them meticulously by date. The pack for day 12 had been torn open. I floated over to the table, my grip tightening on the spanner. The silver foil of the vacuum-sealed pouch was ripped, not sliced open with the provided tab. The dehydrated beef stew inside had been scooped out, but it wasn't the stolen food that made my blood run cold. Next to the torn pouch, on the clean, sterile surface of the metal table, was a smudge. I leaned in close. It was a partial fingerprint, left in a thin film of what looked like dark, greasy engine oil. But it wasn't a gloved print. I could clearly see the ridges and whorls of bare human skin. Someone had been inside the pressurized module. Someone had been standing right here, eating my food while I was asleep. The sheer impossibility of the situation paralyzed me for a moment. To get inside the maintenance bay from the interstitial gap, a person would have to cycle through one of the secondary maintenance airlocks. But the station's computer logged every single airlock cycle. An alarm would have sounded. The main computer would have notified me immediately if interior pressure had been breached. Unless the person knew how to bypass the station's core programming. I left the food untouched and drifted out of the bay, my head on a swivel, checking every shadow, every open doorway. The Artemis Hub suddenly felt massive, a labyrinth of dark corners and blind spots. Every hum of the machinery sounded like breathing. Every shadow looked like a crouching figure. I returned to the command module and locked the heavy reinforced door behind me. I sat down at the terminal, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I didn't bother checking the external cameras anymore. I dove straight into the station's deepest security logs, bypassing the user interface and reading the raw hexadecimal code. If someone was bypassing the system, they would leave a digital footprint. It took me an hour of frantic searching, sweat beading on my forehead and floating away in zero gravity like tiny diamonds. Finally, I found it. A tiny, well-hidden subroutine buried in the environmental control software. It was a ghost protocol designed to temporarily disable the pressure alarms and suppress the airlock cycling logs for exactly 45 seconds at a time. Just long enough for someone to open a maintenance hatch, slip inside, and close it again. The code was brilliant. It was elegant. It required intimate, creator-level knowledge of the station's operating system. I pulled up the crew manifest for the final shuttle. 14 names. I cross-referenced the biometric boarding logs. All 14 people had scanned their retinas, boarded the shuttle, and departed. I stared at the list of names, my eyes locking onto the station's lead systems architect, Elias Thorne. Elias was a genius, an eccentric savant who had practically designed the Artemis Hub from the ground up. He had spent the last 5 years living on the station, rarely returning to Earth. Rumor was that he viewed the station as his life's work, his masterpiece. When Vanguard announced they were decommissioning the hub, Elias had a highly publicized meltdown during a corporate holocall. He had screamed that they were destroying a cathedral of data, that they had no right to tear down what he had built. The company mandated a psychological evaluation, put him on heavy sedatives, and ordered his immediate return to Earth. According to the logs, he had boarded the shuttle. But as I dug deeper into the biometric data, I noticed a discrepancy. The retina scan for Elias Thorne on the day of departure was an exact, pixel-for-pixel duplicate of a scan taken 3 months prior during a routine medical check. It wasn't a live scan. It was a recorded file, injected into the security system to spoof his boarding. Elias Thorne hadn't left. He was still here. The realization hit me with a wave of terrifying clarity. Elias had designed the interstitial gaps. He knew every blind spot, every hidden access panel. He had rigged the sensors. He had been living in the walls of his own creation for nearly 2 weeks, watching the rest of the crew leave, watching me stay behind. But the most pressing, horrifying question remained. How was he surviving in the unpressurized gaps? I pulled up the thermal map again. The heat signature was gone from its previous location. I ran a full station sweep. It took 30 agonizing seconds for the computer to compile the data. When the map refreshed, the heat bloom reappeared. It was moving faster now, no longer crawling cautiously. It was moving with purpose, navigating the complex geometry of the station's skeleton. And it was heading straight for the environmental deck, the central hub that housed the primary oxygen scrubbers and atmospheric controls for the entire station. My blood froze. If Elias gained manual control of the environmental deck, he could vent the atmosphere from the entire habitation ring in a matter of minutes. He could kill me without ever showing his face. I grabbed the hydrospanner, slammed the manual override for the command module door, and launched myself down the primary corridor. I pushed off the walls with everything I had, ignoring the safety protocols. I flew through the zero-gravity environment like a bullet, my boots barely grazing the handholds to correct my trajectory. I passed through Module 3, then Module 5, heading toward the aft section of the station. The lighting in this sector had been dimmed to conserve power. The tunnel was a deep shadows and flickering red emergency lights. The silence was deafening, only broken by the ragged sound of my own breathing. I reached the bulkhead leading to the environmental deck. The heavy door was sealed. I punched my access code into the keypad. The screen flashed green, and the heavy pneumatic locks disengaged with a loud clack. I pulled the door open and floated into the cavernous room. It was the loudest part of the station, filled with the roar of massive fans and the hiss of chemical scrubbers pulling carbon dioxide from the air. The room was a maze of enormous cylindrical tanks and thick bundles of silver ducting. I raised the hydrospanner, my eyes darting frantically across the shadows. "Elias!" I shouted over the roar of the machinery. "I know you're here! I know what you did!" Only the mechanical hum answered me. I moved deeper into the room, checking behind every tank, every support strut. I reached the main control console at the center of the deck. The casing had been violently ripped open. Wires hung out like spilled intestines. The primary atmospheric override switch had been manually engaged. He had locked me out of the system. Before I could process what that meant, I heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of the machinery, chilling me to the bone. A wet, rattling cough. It came from above me. I slowly tilted my head back, looking up toward the ceiling. In the dark recesses between the massive air ducts, a maintenance panel had been removed, exposing the dark, unpressurized interstitial gap. Hanging halfway out of the opening was a figure. It was Elias Thorne, but he barely looked human anymore. He wasn't wearing an EVA suit. He was wearing standard-issue Vanguard overalls, covered in grease and filth. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over his skull like old parchment. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of sanity. But the most horrifying detail was what he was wearing over his face. It wasn't a helmet. It was a crude, homemade breathing apparatus fashioned from torn sections of emergency oxygen masks and sealed with industrial tape. A long, thin plastic tube trailed from the mask, disappearing up into the dark gap, directly tapped into one of the station's high-pressure reserve oxygen lines. He had literally hardwired himself into the station's circulatory system. He was living off the emergency reserves, exposing his body to the near vacuum of the unpressurized gaps, suffering from severe decompression sickness and hypoxia. It was a miracle he was even alive, but the physical toll was evident. His capillaries had burst, leaving dark purple bruising across his face and hands. Elias stared down at me, his chest heaving irregularly. He slowly reached up and pulled the tape-covered mask away from his mouth. His lips were cracked and bleeding. "You're deleting it," he whispered. His voice was a dry, raspy wheeze, completely wrecked by the pressure changes. "You're wiping my mind." "Elias," I said, keeping my voice as calm and steady as I could, gripping the spanner tightly. "Elias, listen to me. The company is decommissioning the hub. It's over. We need to get you to the medical bay. We can call the shuttle early." He let out a short, barking laugh that dissolved into a violent fit of coughing. Tiny droplets of blood floated through the zero-gravity air between us. "The company," he sneered, his eyes twitching frantically. "Vanguard doesn't care about the data. They care about what the data proves. The illegal terraforming algorithms, the genetic patents. They aren't decommissioning the station, Riley. They're scuttling it. They're going to drop it into the Mariana Trench and blame it on a catastrophic orbital decay." "I built this place," he hissed. "Every wire, every line of code. It is perfect. It is immortal. And I am not going to let a corporate janitor come in here and murder it." "I'm just doing my job, Elias. Please come down." Elias smiled. It was a grotesque, broken expression. "I can't let you wipe the cores, Riley, but I can't stop you physically. You're stronger than me now." He raised a hand, revealing a heavy metal wrench he had stolen from the maintenance bay. "But I don't need to fight you. I just need to change the environment." Before I could react, Elias swung the wrench backward, not at me, but at the massive glass-encased master control node on the wall behind him. The glass shattered. Sparks showered the room in a brilliant arc of blue light. Instantly, the deafening roar of the atmospheric scrubbers ground to a halt. The sudden silence was more shocking than a gunshot. The station's primary lighting failed, plunging the deck into pitch blackness. A second later, the blood-red emergency strips flared to life. An automated synthetic voice echoed through the deck.
"Warning, primary life support deactivated. Atmospheric venting initiated in modules 4, 5, and 6. Estimated time to critical hypoxia, 12 minutes.
Elias had initiated an emergency purge. He was venting the oxygen from the station directly into space. "You see, Elias," Elias's voice echoed in the dark from somewhere near the ceiling. "I've learned to breathe very, very slowly. Have you?" There was a scuffling sound, and then Elias vanished back into the dark gap, pulling the access panel shut behind him. Panic exploded in my chest. 12 minutes. I had 12 minutes of breathable air left before I suffocated, where the pressure drop caused my blood to boil. The environmental deck was useless. He had destroyed the control node. There was only one option left. The Soyuz emergency escape pod docked at the far end of the station in Module 1. I turned and launched myself back toward the corridor. The station was already changing. The air felt thin, cold. The change in pressure made my ears pop violently. I gripped the hydrospanner so hard my knuckles ached. I flew through the corridors, moving faster than I ever had. The emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for me as I passed. I checked the digital readout on my wrist comms. Oxygen saturation dropping. 18%, 16%. I burst into Module 3. As I reached the center of the cylindrical room, a heavy metal grating suddenly tore free from a wall vent to my left, spinning through the air like a shrapnel. Elias shot out of the vent like a spider, his movements erratic but impossibly fast in zero gravity. He didn't have his mask on anymore. He was holding his breath, his face purple, his eyes bulging. He tackled me in midair. The impact knocked the wind out of me. We tumbled through the zero-gravity environment, a tangle of limbs, crashing violently into a bank of offline server racks. Elias was incredibly weak, but he had the manic, unhinged strength of a dying man. His hands clawed at my face, trying to gouge my eyes, trying to rip the air from my lungs. I brought my knee up, catching him hard in the ribs. He grunted, his grip loosening just enough. I swung the heavy steel hydrospanner, striking him blindly on the shoulder. You don't hear bones break in a vacuum, but the sickening crunch vibrated up through the handle of the tool. Elias shrieked, a breathless, agonizing sound, and recoiled, clutching his arm. He pushed off the wall, floating away from me, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, his blood forming perfect, floating crimson spheres in the air. He didn't attack again. He just glared at me with pure hatred, grasped a handhold, and pulled himself back toward an open maintenance hatch, disappearing into the dark architecture of the station. I didn't wait. My lungs were burning. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. The air pressure had dropped drastically. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. I kicked off the servers and shot down the final stretch of corridor leading to Module 1. The escape pod airlock was at the very end. 9 minutes. I hit the bulkhead door leading into the staging area. The door slid open, and I practically threw myself inside. The Soyuz pod access hatch was right in front of me, massive and reassuring. Beside it, secured in a locker, was an emergency EVA suit. I slammed my fist onto the pod's release controls. The terminal screen flickered, showing a loading bar.
Pod systems initializing. Clamping release in 60 seconds.
I sagged against the wall, gasping for the thinning air. I had made it. I was going to survive. Then, the terminal screen turned red.
Override command received. Pod clamps locked. Manual release required.
I stared at the screen, my mind refusing to comprehend the words. Override? From where? I looked up. In the corner of the staging area, hidden behind a bundle of communication conduits, was a small, reinforced observation window that looked directly into the interstitial gap. Elias was behind the glass. His face was pressed against the thick pane. He looked worse now. His skin was mottled black and blue. He was dying of hypoxia, his body shutting down. But his hand rested on a manual maintenance terminal spliced directly into the pod's release relays. He had bypassed the system from inside the wall. He had locked the clamps. He was smiling, a horrific, bloody, triumphant smile. He mouthed the words slowly, exaggerating the syllables so I could read his lips. You stay with me. The pod wouldn't launch automatically. The only way to release the pod was to pull the manual explosive bolt lever, but the manual lever was located inside the airlock tube, halfway between the station and the pod. If I opened the interior hatch to get to the lever, the airlock would depressurize. With the station's life support already failing, the sudden vacuum would suck the remaining air out of the staging room in seconds. I looked at the emergency EVA suit in the locker. I looked at Elias grinning through the glass, and I looked at my oxygen monitor. 3 minutes. I tore open the locker and pulled out the bright orange suit. Putting on an EVA suit usually takes 2 people and 10 minutes of careful checks. I had less than 3 minutes, and my brain was severely oxygen deprived. My hands shook violently as I forced my legs into the bulky suit, zipping the heavy pressure seals up to my chest. I glanced at the window. Elias's smile faded. He realized what I was doing. He started punching the glass, his mouth open in a silent scream. I grabbed the heavy fishbowl helmet and locked it onto the neck ring. I twisted it until I heard the sharp click of the seal engaging. I slammed my hand against the suit's chest panel, activating the internal oxygen supply. Cold, clean air flooded the helmet. I took a deep, agonizing breath, my head spinning as the oxygen hit my starving brain. Elias was frantic now. He was slamming his fists against the reinforced glass, leaving bloody smears on the pane. He couldn't stop me. He was trapped in his own hidden world. I turned my back on him and stepped up to the interior airlock hatch. I bypassed the safety protocols and initiated a manual override. The heavy steel doors groaned and slid apart. Instantly, the remaining atmosphere in the staging room was violently sucked out into the airlock tube. Loose tools, debris, and spheres of floating blood were whipped into a violent cyclone, rocketing past me. The noise was a deafening roar that lasted for exactly 2 seconds before the room was completely vented. Then, absolute silence returned. I stepped into the dark, narrow tube of the airlock. At the end of the tube was the hatch to the Soyuz pod. Halfway down the wall was a red handle encased in glass, the manual explosive bolt release. I reached out, my thick, gloved hand clumsy and slow. I smashed the glass casing with the heavy hydrospanner still clutched in my right hand. I grabbed the red handle and pulled with all my strength. The vibration traveled through the floorboards. The explosive bolts detonated, violently severing the physical connection between the pod and the Artemis Hub. The force of the explosion sent a shock wave through the station. I scrambled forward, grabbing the handholds, pulling myself toward the pod's hatch. I spun the wheel, hauled the heavy door open, and threw myself inside the cramped circular capsule. I slammed the hatch shut behind me and locked the sealing ring. I collapsed into the pilot's couch, strapping the 5-point harness over my chest. I hit the massive green launch button on the console. The pod's thrusters fired. The acceleration was immediate and brutal, crushing me back into the seat with a force of 4 Gs. The station was rapidly pushed away as the pod began its descent trajectory toward Earth. I lay there, gasping, my body aching, the roar of the pod's engines vibrating through my bones. I had made it. I had survived the vacuum. I had survived Elias Thorne. As the G-force began to level out, I slowly turned my head to look out the small, thick porthole window set into the pod's hull. The Artemis Hub was shrinking in the distance against the backdrop of the Earth, but without its life support, without its orbital correction thrusters firing, the massive station was already beginning to drift off its axis. It was dying. I stared at the main habitation module as the pod rotated. Through the large windows of the primary observation deck, I saw movement. It was Elias. He had crawled out of the walls. The station was completely depressurized now. He had no mask. He had no suit. He was floating in the center of the dark, airless module. His eyes were ruptured. His skin was frostbitten and bloated from the vacuum. He was dead. But as his lifeless body drifted slowly toward the observation window, his face pressed against the glass one final time. His lips were pulled back in a frozen, permanent smile. He had died exactly where he wanted to be, in his cathedral. And as the station caught the upper edges of the Earth's atmosphere, the friction began to ignite the outer hull. The Artemis Hub began to burn, a massive, brilliant meteor streaking across the sky, carrying its creator into the fire. I closed my eyes, the adrenaline finally leaving my system, leaving me hollow and exhausted. I reached up to unseal my helmet, relishing the sound of the pod's life support humming quietly in the background. I reached into the thigh pocket of my EVA suit to pull out the heavily encrypted master drive I had extracted from the server core days ago, the only proof of Vanguard's illegal data, the only leverage I had to ensure the company didn't silence me when I landed. My gloved fingers touched the drive. I pulled it out and held it up in the dim light of the cabin. It wasn't the heavy, titanium-cased master drive. It was a standard, cheap plastic maintenance drive. I stared at it, my heart stopping in my chest. I turned it over, scratched into the plastic casing. Right next to a smear of dried blood were 3 words: shave and a haircut. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The stolen food, the footprint in the maintenance bay. Elias hadn't just been surviving, he had been planning. He had swapped the drives while I slept. He had ensured that his secrets and his cathedral died with him. The pod shuddered violently as it hit the thicker layers of the Earth's atmosphere, the heat shields glowing white-hot. The communications console on the dashboard lit up, a green light blinking steadily. "Vanguard orbital control to Soyuz Pod 1, a crisp, sterile corporate voice crackled through the speakers. "We have tracked your descent, Mr. Vance. Recovery teams are waiting for you at the splashdown coordinates. We are eager to retrieve the data." I sat alone in the cramped pod, hurtling toward the dark, endless ocean below. The comms light blinked, waiting for my response. I looked at the worthless piece of plastic in my hand. I was safe from the vacuum of space, but as I listened to the cold, expectant voice of the corporation waiting for me at the bottom of the world, I realized the true horror hadn't ended. It was just beginning. I didn't answer. I just listened to the radio static, wishing for one brief, insane moment that I had stayed in the walls.